Hi there. Thanks for joining me here on Conversations for Yoga Teachers. I'm your host, Karen Fabian, the founder of Bare Bones Yoga and the creator of the Momentum Magic Method, the way to become a confident teacher, one who effortlessly walks around the room, shares clear cues, easily builds sequences, and speaks from her heart, sharing authentically with her students. On the podcast, you'll hear anatomy lessons, stories from teachers, interviews with others in the field, and a dose of personal growth, because having a strong, healthy mindset is such an important piece of being a confident teacher. In addition to the podcast, follow me on Instagram and TikTok at Bare Bones Yoga for daily videos. And you'll also see a new link on both of my profiles, my Stand Store link, a literal vending machine for you to select how you best want to be supported as a teacher. There, you'll find links to the podcast, free resources, and other ways I can help you be the best teacher you can be. And don't forget, every single week, in addition to recording you a new episode of this show, I also teach yoga classes and free workshops specifically for yoga teachers. The only way to get your invite is to be on my mailing list. You can do that simply by going to my website, barebonesyoga.com, and down at the bottom, entering your email in the box. Here we go with today's show. Hi there. Welcome to Conversations for Yoga Teachers. My name is Karen Fabian, and I'm your host. And today is episode 308. I'm recording this on August 1st, 2024, and this will go live on August 5th because it is a Monday. And as you know, episodes always go live on Mondays. And with the beginning of August, I'm filled with just a passion for doing all the things that are left on my list of things to do for this summer. And I hope if you're listening to this in the first week of August, that you make the most of these last days of summer too, because, you know, even though for me, I have a very unique schedule because I work for myself, I still feel the ebbs and flows of what many people feel that are in sort of a 9-to-5 mode where, you know, the end of August signifies the end of summer. And I really made a commitment this year to myself to do more things this summer, to just have more experiences. And I've been doing a lot of just day trips and just little things to kind of enrich the week. And I've got a number of kind of bigger things on my list for August. So again, if you're listening to this in the beginning of August, I encourage you to make a list on a Post-it note. What are the things you really would enjoy doing before September 1st? And then make plans to do them and then go out there and enjoy. So this particular episode is going to be a special one because it's really targeted to a specific kind of yoga teacher. And I want to start out by describing who that yoga teacher is, because you may decide this episode isn't for you, or you may decide that you're going to hang out anyway, or this episode might be custom tailored to you. So I'm going to start out by talking to the kind of yoga teacher that this episode is for. And I think before I go into that, let me do that first, because I think that is going to be most relevant to you as the listener, as to whether or not you choose to hang out with me for the remainder of this episode or not. So this episode is specifically for a yoga teacher who has graduated from a 200-hour teacher training, has registered with Yoga Alliance as an RYT 200-hour, and who has started teaching at least one paid class within the past 6 months. So the short form is, this episode is for new yoga teachers who are actively teaching at least one paid class a week, and you started teaching within the past 6 months. And the reason I'm really defining who this episode is for is because the content I plan on sharing today is going to be most relevant to you. because now I'm going to speak to you as if you were that person. So if you're still listening, you must be that person, unless you're just choosing to hang on and hang out and continue to listen, which is totally fine. So when you are in the first 6 months of teaching, you are in a very impressionable phase, meaning it's going to be really easy for you to get off track, meaning the track is where you want to stay because it's where you feel most confident, even though you're newer, and where you are leaning into things that you are building up your skill around and things that you ultimately want to be the foundation for amazing teaching. But when you're in those first handful of months, you're really impressionable. You have everything you learned from your 200-hour training. And then there's always all of these things you're exposed to, whether it's going to somebody's class and thinking, oh, her sequence is really cool. Or maybe it's watching people on social media and thinking, oh, I should be doing that. There are just so many things that hit a new yoga teacher in a unique way because of their newness. Additionally, you might also be thinking, wow, there's just so much to learn. It's going to take me a long time to be a really great teacher. And it's so important that I get to you right now because that, which I just stated, is simply a belief. And the sooner we dispel that belief, the sooner you will transform into a more empowered teacher that isn't walking around thinking, oh, I'm in the first 6 months of teaching, and it's going to take me years to be a good teacher. I want to talk about today why that is just a belief, and that in fact, when you hold that belief, it actually holds you back from being the best teacher you can possibly be. And so now that I've defined, well, and the other thing that I want to speak to is because you're in the first 6 months of teaching, it's so important. And we have such an amazing opportunity to give you some really good habits before you start to develop habits that are not helpful to you. And the longer those habits go unaddressed, the more they become ingrained in how you teach. And it's harder to go back and unlearn those things. A perfect example of this is practicing with your class. Because you're in the first 6 months of your teaching, if you are practicing with your class, it's going to be much easier for you to decouple the act of teaching, the skill of teaching from your own practice. It's going to be much easier for you to unlearn that as a habit that you might right now be doing over and over and over again when you step into the classroom. But if you've been teaching for more than 6 months, it's harder to break that habit. So I want to focus today's conversation on you, the yoga teacher who's done with the 200-hour teacher training, you've registered with Yoga Alliance, and you are a 200-hour teacher and you've been teaching for 6 months or less, and you are teaching. You are putting yourself out there. You have at least one paid class on your schedule. So again, I'm making a distinction between the kind of person who's just teaching freebies to friends and family versus the kind of person who has to show up to teach a class and is getting paid for it. So now that I shared a little bit of that background with you, I want to tell you what's inspired me to do this episode. What's inspired me is one of the teachers who recently enrolled in my program, the Yoga Anatomy Blueprint Learning Program. She enrolled within the past 3 weeks. She is this kind of teacher, the one that I just described. And as I've been working with her, what's been really, just really cool is that she's just so coachable. She's so looking for help to be the best teacher she can be. And so she's sharing a lot with me about what she's doing. And so I'm steering her in this direction of what I'm calling and what I'm going to be speaking to today, this direction of simplifying. And in simplifying, it's taking such a load off her shoulders as to perceptions, beliefs, actual 3D things she's doing in the classroom that she no longer feels like she needs to do. And it's all in an effort to free her up and ultimately free you up from the belief that right now, as a brand new teacher, you need to do complicated things in order to be quote unquote good. And nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, the more things you add on, the harder it is for you to actually access the most confident, empowered part of you. And that's the part of you that you want to show up in your classes. You don't want the scared person, the fearful person, the overwhelmed person, the person whose mind goes blank, the person who feels compelled to practice with class, otherwise they don't know the sequence, the person who's afraid to answer questions and engage with students, the person who beats themselves up because when they drive home, their inner critic is raging and criticizing how they taught that class. Like, you don't want any of that. I don't need to talk to you to know that you don't want any of that, right? Unless you're a masochist, you don't want any of that. But the interesting thing when you're newer is that you actually believe oftentimes that the path to good teaching, the path to quality teaching, the path to amazing teaching lies in adding on all this stuff. That's oftentimes why teachers say to me, oh, well, when I go and take so-and-so's class, she's doing blah, 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 blah. And so I feel compelled like I should be doing blah, 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 because I really liked it. I really liked how it made me feel. We need to start sort of, I mean, it's really a maturity thing. We need to start appreciating that we don't need to teach like everybody else. We need to recognize what we need so that we can show up confidently. And I can promise you 10 times out of 10, what will complicate things more for you is complicating things. What will allow you to access the more elevated part of you, the empowered, confident you, is actually what seems paradoxical. It's to simplify. And when I say simplify at the 3D level, it's really stuff that you're probably going to say, oh my God, Karen, I don't think I can do that because I think my students will be bored or they will get sick of my classes. And all of that is just a belief. I'm not going to tell you right now what the strategy is because that's what we're going to talk about in today's episode. But I wanted to give you a heads up that this is what's coming. So now that we've talked about who this episode is for and what inspired me to share this episode, I want to speak to one other thing, which is the format for today's episode. I originally wanted to do this in 3 parts because I really want you to consume this in 3 parts, in 3 steps. But I didn't want to sort of drip it out, time release it in terms of one Monday and then a following Monday and a following Monday, or even a Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I really wanted to give it to you kind of like a Netflix series on binge, where I give you the whole thing in one fell swoop. However, having said that, what I really encourage you to do is listen to part 1 and then maybe go off and do something, and then listen to part 2 and go off and do something, and then listen to part 3. So if you can sort of hold off on maybe that feeling to just binge the whole thing, the reason I'm asking you to do that and the logic behind it is really grounded in neuroscience and cognitive learning. That if you consume the whole thing in one sitting, you're not giving yourself, your thinking part of yourself, your intuitive part of yourself, time to process. And I've done a lot of work in thinking about how to cut this conversation up into 3 sections so that you can digest part 1 and then part 2 and then part 3, and with a little break in between, maybe even a day. So listen to part 1 and then hold off until the next day, etc. You are going to get so much more out of this. I would also recommend, if you want to get really detailed, to listen to part 1 and then get a good night's sleep, and then listen to part 2 and get a good night's sleep, and then listen to part 3. Because, and I get a lot of this information and learning from listening to Andrew Huberman's podcast about cognitive learning. is that the sleep phase is when our brain is regenerating. It's cleansing. There's a whole bunch of science behind what's actually happening physiologically when we sleep with regard to our brain. And so that overnight cleansing of the brain and processing of the memory is really helpful so that when you get to the next day and you listen to part two, you can add that in to what you learned in part one rather than binging the whole thing. So, and again, when we watch Netflix, we're not really doing it for learning, we're doing it for fun. So that's why binging in that context is totally fine. But binging in the learning context oftentimes just exhausts us and we don't retain information, which is why you may have the same experience that many yoga teachers tell me they had with regard to their 200-hour training. They say things like, there was so much information, it was such a brain dump, I don't remember anything. So that's perfect proof of the concept I'm talking about, which is if we overwhelm the brain with all sorts of content, oftentimes the sticking, right, the actual retention of the information is lost. So now that I've talked about the format, let's get into part one. And I'll tell you when part one is done and part two so that you can shut it off and come back the next day. For this first part, what I want to share with you is a couple of stories of the impact of not just fear, but hesitation and lack of confidence on yoga teachers. And I get these stories directly from my own experience of working with yoga teachers one-on-one. And I wanted to start out like this because I want to make it really real. And hearing these stories, you may hear yourself in some of these stories. And that would be a really important connection. Even if it's not exact, having maybe an adjacent experience can be really powerful to just hear. And in hearing it, you might actually feel some relief, like, oh my God, I'm not alone. And I know when I have conversations with teachers, they often say to me, wow, I had no idea that anybody else was thinking like this. So when I was putting this all together, the first thing I was reminded of was my client, Chloe. And she's a former client, and she's a former teacher that enrolled in my program. When I had met her, she was a yoga teacher who struggled a great deal with her confidence. She would notice her nerves starting to ramp up on Sunday night as she anticipated teaching her yoga classes for the week ahead. She would think things like, is my sequence good enough? Maybe I should change it. She'd practice it over and over again. She'd rewrite her notes, hoping that it would help her feel better. But by the time her first class of the week arrived, she was in a full-blown panic. On her drive to the studio, she would wonder, is all of this actually worth it? But, for her, that's her experience. Maybe for you, it shows up as imposter syndrome, things like, I'm not good enough. Or maybe you compare yourself to other teachers, saying to yourself, man, I just took her class and she's so much better than me. Or maybe it shows up as pressure. It needs to be perfect. And then something else that I've heard is the family member who just doesn't get it, such as the husband or the partner who can sense that you're getting nervous and says, hey, it's not like it's brain surgery. What are you so nervous about? So what this all comes down to is a confidence problem. So how might you typically go about fixing this? And that's oftentimes the question that I get. Maybe you try to feel better by over preparing. Maybe you create a new sequence every week, believing that the one you already know and have used isn't good enough, and your students won't like you if you teach a similar sequence from class to class. You might also practice your cues and write them down while you're doing the sequence, only to experience what teachers have told me is mind going blank syndrome when you get into the studio. And then, like I said earlier, you overanalyze how it went, attempting to talk yourself out of whatever bad feelings come up. But when that doesn't work, you might actually question, am I really cut out for this? And I want you to instead imagine something different. Walking into the room with a sense of excitement. Imagine greeting your students, sharing a few words about what to expect, and then beginning your class with no notes and not even the urge to put a yoga mat down. I can tell you from my own experience of teaching, that is exactly what I do. I walk in the room, I don't have any notes, I don't put a mat down, I have the sequence that I know inside and out in my head, and I just begin. I want you to imagine moving throughout the room, providing instructions and seeing for yourself that your students are listening and understanding what you say. Imagine as the end of class nears and the students are resting in the final pose, you feel inspired to share a few words of your own, right from your own heart. You don't read from a book. You don't have any prepared quote. You didn't have to do any lead time preparation to figure out what you were going to read. You're just speaking from the heart. And you're feeling like you're doing exactly what you were born to do. But how might this be possible? How might you go from this lack of confidence that Chloe and other teachers have, and maybe you have, to this experience of connection, confidence, and fulfillment? Well, let me just kind of frame this for you in a way that you might not have actually ever thought of before. I know when I share this with teachers, they say, "Oh my God, I've never actually thought of yoga teaching through that lens." Yoga teaching is a really special role. It can, not only erode our confidence, it can stir up uncomfortable feelings from a long time ago, such as reminding you of the time you answered a question incorrectly in grade school. Unlike other areas of expertise and skill, teaching yoga involves not only instruction, but also public speaking, managing a group, sharing from your own words, and showing up as an expert. And you're teaching a framework that's been around for thousands of years. In today's world, it also involves moving beyond a set of rules given in teacher training to a way of teaching that's more natural to you, more authentic, more you showing up for your students. Without the ability to build your confidence, all you're left with is believing that you have to do everything you've been told. You write down your script, you build a sequence with a peak pose, you change your sequence every week, you follow all the rules, even though they don't change how you feel. But I'm just going to share something with you. It's the God's honest truth. The simple truth is that students don't come into class for an original sequence, a complicated sequence, a perfectly delivered script. What they actually want is to have agency over their own experience. This means that even if they're falling all over the place, it's a win for them because they're there. They're in class and they're practicing yoga. Students want essential clear cues in a space where they can find presence and peace, challenge themselves, and learn. Now, as I worked with Chloe, she began to see that the pressure and dread she was feeling before teaching was coming from a part of her that was telling her that she wasn't good enough and she wasn't going to be able to do it right. I call that the inner critic. Now, I didn't come up with that phrase, but I call it that in the context of teaching yoga, that inner critic, that inner voice that's telling you you're not doing it right. And she described this feeling as overwhelming, and it left her feeling like she was at rock bottom. She wasn't cut out for this. Now, when I explored with her, where is this voice coming from? She actually realized, and it took a lot of courage for her to admit this, that it reminded her of growing up and her dad, who really emphasized great, getting really good grades and being a perfect student. And those memories were sort of conjured up from her childhood. And as she taught yoga, she kept repeating this kind of negative self-talk. And because she had this belief from growing up that perfect was the only acceptable outcome, she could never meet this expectation when she taught. The bar of an acceptable class for her was it has to be perfect as defined by me, not I showed up confidently and authentically and taught a great class. When we worked together, she said, I need to change my sequence every week or my students will get bored. She had a very rigid way of thinking, which is super common. So I said to her, how do you know that your students will get bored? Do you think people will come up to you and say, hey, your class is boring? And she was like, no. And I said, well, even if someone did, does that mean that every student also thinks the class is boring? And she said, no, of course not. And I said, well, what if you just played with teaching the class 4 weeks in a row using the same sequence? Is that something you'd be willing to try? And she said, yeah, I guess so. Maybe if it's just 4 weeks. And within a couple of weeks of that conversation, everything changed. On our next call, our next coaching call, she told me she felt a huge shift. This was a light bulb moment for her. Her confidence was growing and she was experimenting with teaching the same sequence from class to class, as we discussed, and it was having no effect on attendance or anything else. No one seemed to mind. And what's more important, she was able to get better at the sequence, and that helped to build her confidence. So, how did what we discussed wind up having such a huge impact on her? See, she had this belief, and beliefs often come from what we were told as a child before we had free will over what to think. Yoga teachers have that past experience that leads to their beliefs, plus all of what they're told in teacher training. Much of how yoga teachers are trained is based on this guru model, where one person provides the training and shares their model of teaching. Many teachers give up their own sense of agency to the person who trained them, even going so far as to say, I'm teaching this way because that's the way I was trained, or I'm using these cues because that's what I was trained to say. And so imagine you as the teacher want to try something new, like having the same basic sequence instead of creating a new one every week like you were told to in training. You might then commit yourself to no longer changing up the sequence from now on. But the energy behind committing to something when it comes to behavior change comes from the same place as willpower. And we all know that willpower typically doesn't work when we want to make a change. Just saying, I'm not going to eat any sugar, or I'm going to hold off on, I don't know, this or that, doesn't work. It feels like pressure. That's why they call it willpower. Do you have the power to overtake your will? And so that reinforces the rigid way of thinking, which is exactly what causes so much of the confidence problem. So in my conversation with Chloe, we opened the door to other possibilities and approaches, and we framed it like a science experiment. The real magic of experimenting comes from using a new approach and then evaluating the results. The teacher who believes at an identity level that she's shy and she could never walk around the room and teach, so she hides in her own practice as she teaches. She could experiment with walking in the room, greeting the class, and standing in front of them as she teaches the first handful of poses, even though she's nervous and it feels awkward. With just that one experiment, she starts to loosen her belief around her identity just a little. Starting with that first experiment can then lead to teaching more of the poses from standing, which could then lead to walking around the room. Pretty soon, she's tossed her rigidly held belief simply by being willing to experiment with a new approach. Chloe and many other teachers have transformed their teaching with this approach because your confidence as a yoga teacher comes less from the hours of training you've completed and more from your willingness to experiment. It's through trying things but not committing to them that you can shift the beliefs that have kept you in fear and hidden your confidence. So that story is just one of many, but I wanted to give you that story as just an example of how beliefs can impact how we show up. Now, I know I said at the beginning of this episode, I wanted to focus on simplifying, and I'm going to get to that in part 2 and part 3. Specifically, how can you simplify and what does that look like at the ground level? I wanted to start, though, with these stories to give you a sense of how overcomplicating things can actually get in the way of being that confident teacher. And in some cases, it is tied to this belief conversation. In other cases, it can be a little bit of that, and it also can be on the ground level, like on the technical level. You're adding all these extra bells and whistles to your classes that you really don't need, and that they're actually getting in the way of you being more confident. Even that, though, is belief driven, right? Because when we go and take, for instance, someone's class and we say, oh, I need to add this to my class because this person's class is full and there's a lot of students here, so this is proof that people need this, that people want this, and then we bring that into our class, that's just all a belief. The best approach to teaching confidently is to do what serves you. And I know that sounds counterintuitive because it seems self-serving in a process that's really focused on the student. Keep in mind, though, and again, this is another paradoxical thing. In order for you to be positioned in the best position possible to help your students, you need to help yourself first. It's just like the oxygen mask in the plane. You need to put that on first before you could help a child. You need to take care of yourself first in terms of, do I know the sequence I'm going to teach? Do I have a strategy for my cues? Because once you have those two pieces in place, and there I already kind of spoiled it by giving you the two. Once you have those two pieces in place, you can serve, help, assist your students so much more. I don't mean physically assist. It's just you can be there for your students so much more when you take care of those two things. But if you're constantly changing what you're offering out of these beliefs, this is what you need to do, that's not focused on you. That is, again, belief driven. Okay, so what I want to do at this point, this is the end of part one. This is the end of part one. So in a perfect world, what I'd love you to do is turn this off, and I'll give you a little homework that you can do in between here. You could write down on a Post-it note, what are 3 beliefs that you have about teaching yoga, about you as a yoga teacher. If you were to tell someone, these are things that I believe about me as a yoga teacher, start to get some of these beliefs down on paper. It could be, I believe it's going to take me 2 to 3 years to be a really good teacher. I believe that I need to practice with my students. I believe that I need to share anatomy or my students won't like my class. I believe that I need to bring something profound to read at the end of class in order to give a Dharma talk that will motivate and inspire students. Like whatever the beliefs are, start to write them down and have the courage to really ask yourself, what are the beliefs that are driving the way I teach? So we're going to end part one now, and we'll go to part two in a moment. So I'm just going to take like a beat here so you can turn off the recording and then come back tomorrow. Okay, so here we are in part two. So in part one, we talked about beliefs, and we talked about who this episode is for and what's inspired this episode. And now I'm going to start to reveal, even though I gave you a little mini reveal in part one, what is the recipe for simplifying? Knowing that when we simplify, we are setting ourselves up for success when it comes to teaching confidently. So let me start here. Imagine you're going on a weekend getaway. You're going on a short weekend trip. And even though you're the kind of person who typically packs a ton and has one of those big bags, you are going to experiment with being the kind of person who can simplify. You're going to experiment with a different identity, the kind of person who can throw a bathing suit, a couple pairs of shorts, a couple of t-shirts, and one dress and flip-flops in an overnight bag and just call an Uber and get taken to the airport. That's going to be you. And even though you don't connect to that identity, you have an affinity for that. Like you see things in movies, you see things in TV shows, you see things with your friends or on social media where people are doing this sort of thing. Like the girl just has a scarf around the back or a scarf around her neck, and she's just like running out with the flip-flops on. She's like, I'm going to Miami or going to Turks and Caicos, whatever it is. And you sort of aspire to that, but you have this identity that I'm not the kind of person who could do that. I need to bring a bunch of stuff. I need to have backup. I need to have, shoes for every possible occasion. And then you're also the kind of person who, when you come home, you're kicking yourself because everything you're unpacking, 80% of it, you never wear. Like, am I right or am I right? So this is a similar thing. And this is why I told you this little metaphor, this little story, because this is similar to what we're going to talk about here. We're going to talk about this idea of simplifying as a path to empowered, confident yoga teaching. And the reason we're doing that is because in the story I just told about packing, this means when you get to your destination, you don't have a whole bunch of stuff to unpack. This means that when you are getting up in the morning, you know exactly what you're going to wear. You're going to put the bathing suit on and the white t-shirt and the jean shorts and the flip-flops. Like you're making your life so much easier. You're giving yourself so much more time to be present and enjoy your vacation. Again, this is such a beautiful metaphor for teaching yoga, because when you simplify your approach to teaching yoga, you are that girl that's on vacation with so much additional time and so much ease of mind because you don't have that big ass suitcase in your hotel room overflowing with stuff. And in the morning, you're not like, oh my God, what am I going to wear today? What's the category of thing we're doing? I need to have the whatever, Tiva sandals, and I need to have that blah, blah, blah. You're not that person. You're like, yo, I just got my bathing suit on, you know? So when you're teaching with that approach, with this foundation of simplification, you have so much more energy available to you to be there for your students, to watch what they are doing, to be present, to have the freedom to walk around the room, to have the courage to get off your mat, right? Like part of transitioning from the practice with me approach to the walk and talk is a strategic one, and there are specific steps to do that. We're not actually going to get into that today, but oftentimes just the act of simplifying your approach to teaching will allow you to experiment. Remember, we talked about experimenting in part one. Experiment with the walk and talk more than you would ever do when you're overcomplicating things. Because when you overcomplicate things, you often need to practice with your students because, and I'm not making this up, this is all from years of working with teachers and stuff that they tell me, I need to practice with my students. Otherwise, I don't know what comes next in the sequence. So imagine instead, you have an essential sequence that you teach over and over again, and you get to know it so well. Now you're thinking, I don't even need to do this. I can just walk around the room, and now you're upright and your voice is more clear because you're not practicing with them. Now you can see them. Now, if they have granted you permission, you can assist them. And it's like a whole new world. And now you're accessing that confident part of you, that empowered part of you. So the two ingredients to simplify your teaching is a sequence that you teach over and over again until you know it so well, you can teach it without notes and by doing the walk and talk. And the second part to simplifying is using one strategy for your cues, which is an action cues strategy. So let me repeat that. And you can use this metaphor of packing your bag. So if you're packing your metaphorical yoga teacher confidence bag, all you're packing are two things: my go-to sequence and my action cues. Now, within the bucket, or imagine you have a little bag in your bag, like a little zip up bag in your bag, And it says on the cover of the bag, or it says on the bag itself, action cues. And then when you unzip the bag, in the bag are all the action cues. Step your foot forward, reach your arms up, draw your belly button in, bring your feet together, lean to the side, drop your back heel. You know, action, 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 action. Tell your students what you want them to do. Just focus on action. So that's all that's in your bag. That is all that is in your Confident Yoga Teacher bag. My go-to sequence and my action cues. All right, so now that you know the 2 ingredients, we're going to, in this part 2, break down the cueing part. And then in part 3, which is the final part of this episode, we will do the sequencing part. So I want you to get something to write with and a Post-it note or a piece of paper. You're going to want to take notes for this. So cueing. There are 4 types of cues: action, alignment, anatomy, and somatic. Action cues are just what they sound like. Telling your students the action you want them to do. These are the most understandable. These are the easiest for teachers to provide because most, if not all, teachers know what to do to get into a pose if just focusing on action. Doesn't mean it's easy to share the cue, but they know from their own practice and from their training just the steps. You know, warrior 1 is step your right foot forward, put your back heel down, reach your arms up in the air. There's different ways to say it, but you know what makes the shape. You might not know the anatomy behind it. You might not know how to phrase the somatic cue. You might not know the alignment piece, but you know how to tell somebody to get into the pose. Now, there still can be a whittling down because if we keep leaning into the simplification, notice I didn't say something like, okay, I want you to step your right foot forward, but make sure your foot is straight ahead. Now, I want you to spread your toes and press into your heel. Now, take your back foot and turn it 45 degrees out. Make sure your heels are on, right? So you're already exhausted because I'm sharing too much. It's too detailed. So there is a skill to the action cues in that they're succinct and they're clear and they're words that everybody understands. But this is, again, why simplifying is so important, because as you can see, even if you just focus on action cues and leverage what you know about how to get into the poses, there still is a whole bunch of skill you're going to be developing around what is the clearest way to share action cues. But you're going to get to be a really good teacher around sharing action cues way faster when that is the only strategy you're using for your classes over and over and over and over and over again, versus if you're going in and trying to share anatomy cues and trying to share somatic cues and doing a body scan and doing this and doing that. And no, you are singleness of focus because you're new and you want to, as quickly as possible, tap into that most confident, empowered part of you. And the fail-proof way to do that is by simplifying. Okay, so we talked about the 4 types of cues: action, alignment, anatomy, and somatic. Now we're going to talk in more detail about the cues approach you're going to use. This is the strategy. Teacher trainings don't talk about strategy. I talk about strategy. I have a business background. I'm an entrepreneur. Everything I do is formulated with a strategy in mind. I'm not just throwing shit at the wall. You need to have the same approach with your teaching. There needs to be a strategic, intentional decision behind what you're doing. So here you're making the intentional decision to use action cues in your classes in an effort to be able to develop a high degree of skill around sharing action cues, knowing that action cues are the most understandable type of cue to share with your students. They don't require specialized knowledge about yoga. They're super easy words for people to understand. They can be shared by you in an easier way than sharing more complex words. They don't require specialized knowledge on your part with respect to anatomy or somatics or nervous system, any of that. So right out of the gate, we're already setting ourselves up for much more success than if we were going into all other different types of cues. Let me just also pause here and tell you, you don't need anybody's permission to do what I'm suggesting here. So if you're thinking, oh my God, I could never just teach action cues. Aren't I supposed to be speaking to the anatomy and speaking to the somatics and doing this and doing? No, you can do whatever you want. You don't need anybody's permission to teach with an action cue strategy. This is what I mean about beliefs. When I asked you in part 1 as your homework to write down your beliefs, you may have been a little stumped, like, I don't really have any beliefs. I don't know what she's talking about. But right now, here we are at this critical moment where you might be saying to yourself, I could never just teach action cues. I'm supposed to be using complicated cues and complicated sequencing and speaking to the anatomy. Belief, 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 belief. You are the priority. You are the priority. The more you are doing what serves you, meaning what puts you in a position to be the most confident, skilled teacher, the better you are for your students. So if in your head you're like, wow, teaching just action cues would be such a load off, I would feel so much less pressure. I wouldn't have to be trying to fake anatomy or figure out the anatomy. You mean I could just teach from action? I'm allowed to do that? Yes, you can do whatever you want. You don't need anybody's permission. This is what I mean when I say empowered yoga teacher. An empowered yoga teacher is doing what they know is necessary for them, what they want to do. And I don't mean want to do like, oh, I want to teach blah, 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 my classes. I mean, I'm an intentional, confident, empowered teacher, and I'm going to teach in a way that, again, serves me, puts me in the best position to put my best foot forward. Okay, so now that we've talked about the 4 types of cues and a little sidebar on permission, you don't need anybody's permission to do this. What does this actually look like? So what this looks like is you're going into your class, you're saying to yourself before class, the framework I'm going to use for my cues is action cues only. And now you want to probably whittle down what you're already saying to action cues only. I don't know how you're teaching, but I'm going to bet 9 times out of 10, you're saying too much. Now, there is a specific cueing style called conversational cueing. I mean, again, these are terms I came up with. And as you get more skilled as a teacher, you can do conversational cueing. But it's really hard as a newer teacher to use conversational cues because it ends up being way too much. And it's typically not conversation. What newer teachers typically do is they throw everything and the kitchen sink at the students because there's a very, there's a lack of discernment. I learned all this stuff in training. I'm supposed to be saying all this stuff. I have to say all this stuff. If I don't say all this stuff, it's going to be wrong. And so this is where throwing everything and the kitchen sink at the student comes into play. What I am asking you to do and experiment with is probably saying 50 to 60% less than you're saying now. And that includes cueing to the breath. Inhale, lift the leg. Exhale, step the foot forward. Inhale, reach up. Exhale, getting rid of all the breathing cues. They're going to be breathing. You don't need to worry about it. And all of these super fine-tuned details, the lifting of the knuckles in downward dog, the pressing into the soft fleshy part between your thumb and index finger in downward dog, the foot at 45 degrees in warrior 1, all of these things that are just like so fine-tuned, detailed, like making an origami, building a Kia thing, like it's too much. You're teaching movement. It's a broad brush. We're not doing brain surgery here. And the more you loosen your potential, if you have this attachment to all of these fine-tuned details, you are going to feel such relief, such a load off. Like, I don't need to even say all this stuff anymore. I can just say, step your foot forward. I can just say, come up to standing instead of, okay, I want you to roll up slowly, 1 vertebrae at a time. Now, let me just take a pause here also and say, number one, I'm not telling you how to teach. Number two, I'm not saying that any of these things I'm using in my examples here are bad teaching or wrong teaching. Number three, there is always a context for what I am saying. Number four, you can teach however you want. I think I said that before, and number five, I am not saying any of these things because I want you to feel badly. There is no right or wrong, bad or good. None of these are good cues. I am giving you this information as suggestions, as things to experiment with. And also, it's coming from years of experience and in knowing from my own teaching that getting to the fine-tuned level doesn't have an appreciable advantage to students versus just giving them action cues. Now, as you get more experienced as a teacher, that's when we start to add things on. Maybe then you start to go into a little bit more detail. But we're talking, that's why I said in part one, this conversation is for a very specific kind of person, right? I want to make things crystal clear and easier for you when you step into the classroom so that you can shine through as that confident, empowered teacher. The more I throw at you around getting into the fine-tuned details, the harder it is for that part of you to shine through. But you might not actually believe that because of whatever you were told in teacher training and all the stuff you see online. And so you may go in with this belief, there it is again, belief that, well, I have to tell people to breathe. It's a breathing practice. I have to tell people inhale, exhale, or they won't know the rhythm. Can I just tell you, 90% of your students are not going to be breathing in sync with what you're cueing anyway. And also, it is not defaming the practice at all to not speak to the breath 100% of the time. Breathing is automatic, autonomic, right? So yes, you can cue them to the breath, but you don't need to do it all the time. Okay, so as we wrap up this part two and we focus on action cues, let me just say, the conversation around cueing is around even just action cueing is obviously a lot longer than this episode, but we don't have time in this episode to go into the whole thing. That's what I work with teachers inside my program to teach them. What I wanted to convey to you today is in this theme of simplifying. Remember when we packed our proverbial confident yoga teacher bag, we only put two things in there. We didn't even put flip-flops. We put action cues and a sequence I know really, really well, my go-to sequence. So here we're in this first part talking about cueing, action cueing, right? Okay, so for right now, we're going to end part two. I want you to shut this off, get a good night's sleep, and come back for part three. For your homework, what I want you to do is get out a piece of paper or you could even do this in a recording fashion. And that's actually going to be better if you record it. Just record yourself on a Zoom or with a recording in your phone, an audio function in your phone. And I want you to just walk through either your whole sequence or some portion, maybe the first 10 minutes of your sequence, with a frame of mind that my strategy is going to be action cues only. And see how much you can whittle away so you are left with just pure action cues, and start to play around with that. Start to experiment with an action cues only approach just in a little trial demo you'll do just on the recording. So there you go. There's your homework. End of part two. I'll see you for part three. Okay, so here we are, the final part of this 3-part podcast episode. This last part here is about sequencing. So we packed our bag using the metaphor from part two, and we already went over the action cues format. So now we're going to talk about the go-to sequence. So the go-to sequence becomes our fundamental sequence we teach over and over and over again. And we keep teaching it until we know it inside out. We can teach it without notes, and we can teach it by 100% walking around the room, not doing one pose. So that's your bar. That's That's the level you want to get to before you even think about changing it, before you even think about doing a new sequence. So right out of the gate, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh my God, Karen, my students are going to be so sick of this sequence. What if it takes me 3 months to be able to get to that bar, to get to that point? Okay, so let's break that down. Have you ever heard of Bikram yoga? Have you ever heard of core power yoga? Have you ever heard of Baptiste power yoga? I was one of the first certified Baptiste yoga teachers. I worked for Baron directly for several years. It was the same sequence. It is the same sequence. It is the same sequence. Bikram, same sequence, 26 poses, right? Core power, when you go to their studios, it is a handful of classes, the same sequence. There are empires of yoga built on the same sequence. So that is proof that you don't need to change your sequence all the time or your students will get bored. Number two, again, remember what I said in part two. If changing the sequence means you don't know what the heck is going on, how is that helping them? It's not helping them. What helps them is what helps you. Or the converse, what helps you is what helps them. So to be driven out of a belief that you need to change it or your students will get bored, and then the actuality is you go into your class and you're tied to your yoga mat because that's how you remember what comes next, and you have tons of notes that you constantly keep looking at, that's not helping you and it's not helping them. So that is just a belief. And again, just like we talked about in part one, when I shared the story of Chloe, if you don't believe it, just experiment with it. Instead of saying, oh my God, Karen, it's going to take 90 days, just give yourself 3 weeks. In 3 weeks, you'll have 3 classes. That's just 3 classes. If you committed to teaching the same sequence 3 times in a row, by the end of that 3rd time, you would be so much better at that sequence than the first time. You'd be so much better at it that I'd be willing to bet you $100 that you'd be willing to experiment 3 more classes. And then you got 6 times. And then you probably feel even so much more confident. You're probably going to do it 3 more times, right? And on and on and on. And then pretty soon you'll be like, why do we even worry about changing the sequence? This is ridiculous. I'm feeling so much more confident that I'm able to be more spontaneous. I'm able to really walk around. I can really see my students. Like, this is all the stuff that comes out in these light bulb moments that teachers have when they work with me, when they are guided by me into these experiments that they would never have come up with on their own because the beliefs are driving what they're doing. You can't think yourself out of a belief. You need someone else to see what's driving you and to, of course, this is subject matter knowledge. So a yoga teacher to offer you another approach to experiment with, because you can't think yourself out of the box because you're in the box. You created the belief and that's what's fueling you. So that's what I'm here for. And that's what these conversations are about. So creation of a go-to sequence. The first thing I'm going to suggest is go to my Instagram. I know you're listening on your phone, so just go right now. You can keep this podcast running as you go to my Instagram. When you get over to my Instagram page, Bare Bones Yoga, click the link in my bio. So go ahead, you're doing that now. And when you click the link in my bio, you're going to see free sequence template. So just do that now, download that, and get that template, because what we're going to go over today is on that template. So now that you have that, you can look at it after this episode. You can print it out or just look at it on your computer. What that template does is it walks you through my 3-step process for creating a sequence. Okay. Now, I want you to take a look at it, even if you already have a go-to sequence, or even if this concept of coming up with a go-to sequence basically just means you lean into a sequence you already have and you just designate it as, okay, this is going to be my go-to sequence. This is the one I'm going to use for the next couple of classes or couple of months. So let's just be sure, though, the go-to sequence, number one, needs to be highly accessible. It shouldn't be something super complicated. It shouldn't be something with a lot of advanced variations. It should be something that anybody can do regardless of their experience with yoga. Unless you teach a specialized group or a special population where the nature of your go-to sequence has to be customized to that population. Other than that, one-off, It should be a sequence that anybody can do of any age, any experience with yoga. Okay. And we already talked about the second piece, which is you need to agree with yourself that you're going to use this as your go-to sequence over and over and over and over and over again until you hit those 2 bars. First bar, I can teach it without notes. Second bar, I can teach it 100% by doing the walk and talk versus the practice with me approach. Once I hit those 2 bars, I have now earned the right for myself to introduce either new poses into that sequence or a whole new sequence. But know that when you go to a whole new sequence, you go back to square one. You start a learning process again. This is why it's so crazy to me that teachers change their sequences all the time. They're constantly pulling the rug out from underneath them. When you stick to the same sequence, you build knowledge. You develop what's known as unconscious competence. You don't even need to think about the sequence. You know it so well, you don't even need to think about it. You give yourself all this extra brain power to be present, to come up with better cues, to really see your students, so much more brain power available. So the next piece about this go-to sequence is it needs to have a logical flow. Now, that's a more detailed conversation than we're going to have here. This is part of what would happen if we work together inside my program. I would coach you on how to do this. But I want you to just think about, it doesn't necessarily need to be in the format of a peak, of a sequence with a peak pose, but there needs to be a logical flow, meaning you're starting people out with some sort of grounding activity. You're then doing some type of warm up. You're then taking them through some type of active arrangement of postures, and then you're cooling them down. An example of what that would not look like is in the first pose you have them do something like a back bend. And in the last pose that you have them do like a triangle. Like you wouldn't start your class with wheel and you wouldn't end your class with triangle. Those are active poses that require preparation. And ending your class with triangle, that posture on the feet doesn't give students an ability to calm the nervous system, to down-regulate. So if you want to think of this go-to sequence in a peak pose format, think of the bell curve. You start on the downside, you work up to something, and then you work down to a more relaxed, grounded, down-regulated nervous system state. But you can also think of it as a straight line, or you could think of it as a little bit of a, not a super high peak, but more of just like a little peak. So that's what I mean when I say logical. I also call it intelligent sequencing. So that's the part about sequencing. Now, of course, here in this conversation, I don't know what your sequence is. I don't know what your ability level is in creating sequences. You know, there's a lot I don't know because obviously we're not working together. But I want to, in this part of the conversation, I want to share with you, those are the components. So let's just recap here. Number one, you're going to download the sequence building template from my Instagram page if you haven't already. Number two, that template's going to give you exactly how to build a go-to sequence. Number three, there needs to be an intelligent sequencing logic that is intrinsic in this sequence. And I just gave you an example of what wouldn't be very logical and what is more logical. And number four, you're going to commit to teaching the sequence over and over again until those 2 bars have been met. Oh, and then there's one other thing. The last thing is you're going to create this sequence based on what you know right now. This is huge. This is huge. What this looks like in the 3D level is you're not pulling out your books, you're not pulling out your app, you're not pulling out your sketchbook, you're not searching on YouTube or social media, none of it. You are saying to yourself, I already know enough about yoga to create a sequence. I don't need all this outside influence. Outside influence is just going to overcomplicate things. I'm simply going to sit down with a piece of paper, maybe Karen's template, sequence template that I just suggested you get, and I'm just going to create this sequence based on what I know. That's it. I trust myself. See, this is what I mean about being empowered. Like, it's not, again, I know I'm speaking very energetically to you because I'm so passionate about this subject. It's not a bad thing to look at sequencing books. It's not a bad thing to look on YouTube. And, it's not a bad thing to go to somebody's class and say, oh, they did a little whoop-de-doo. I'd like to do that whoop-de-doo in my class. It's not bad. None of it is bad. It's just that what I'm impressing upon you is how empowering it is to just be like, you know what? I don't need anybody else's suggestions. I can teach how I want. And that's more than enough. It's more than enough. Like, keep in mind, yoga's been around for thousands of years. You don't need to make it interesting. It is interesting. If it wasn't interesting, we wouldn't still be doing it. So having the faith and confidence in yourself that what you know is enough, that alone will up-level your confidence tremendously. Okay. So in the last 2 or 3 minutes here, here's how I want to tie this all together. We started out this 3-part episode talking about who this conversation is for. What inspired me to do this episode, this inspiration around simplifying and the power of simplifying. I then started out by sharing some stories with you about teachers I've worked with, about how beliefs were holding them back from being a truly empowered, confident teacher, and about how the power of experimentation, even more so than hours of training, was really what was helping them find their confidence as a yoga teacher. I then presented you with this metaphor of packing for a trip, this carefree person going on a trip that you aspire to be, and that same metaphor of just packing light for a weekend getaway can be applied to you as a yoga teacher in service to helping you just go into the room and teach your class with no notes and doing the walk and talk and just loving what you're doing and feeling confident. And I described how the 2 essential components of that are strategic components, a go-to sequence that you teach over and over again, and an action cues framework. I then also said, in describing a little bit about the cueing and sequencing strategy, that I didn't have the time, nor is it appropriate for me to go into the level of detail that's needed for you to really know this here on the podcast, because it's not even a visual format. I need to see you. I need to work with you. I need to give you all the details of the how to do that, working with you one-on-one. But I wanted to give you the recipe so that you could see I'm not just making stuff up. Like, I have proof that this works. This is an approach that I've used. This is an approach that I teach teachers in my program, and I absolutely know it works, and it can work for you if you are the person that I described. So with that, here's what I want to offer you. You're listening to this hopefully in August of 2024. If you're not listening to this in August of 2024, then this offer I'm going to share won't apply to you. If you are listening to this in August of 2024, here's what I want to offer you. I want to offer you a back to school special to enroll in my program, either in the last week of August or the first week of September. So if you're listening to this in the month of August, I'm going to be opening the doors to my program, to a special back to school accelerator program, the last week in August and the first week in September. What this will give you is all the detail around cueing and sequencing, along with walking through my 10-step blueprint to learning just what you need to know on the anatomy so that you will understand anatomy as well. You'll receive your certification in anatomy from me, and you'll receive up to 30 hours of CEU credits that you can use towards your Yoga Alliance 200-hour CEU requirement. So just with my program, you'll not only be certified, you'll also receive up to, and maybe all of, depending on how many hours you go through the program. Some people do it in a little less than 30, but most people take about 30. And that will be your whole requirement, your whole CEU requirement for 3 years. You won't have to take any other programs. You can, of course, but that'll just be extra CEU credits you get for those. So this back to school accelerated program will have you done in 60 days. So in 2 months, you'll be done with the program, and you'll have the anatomy, the cueing, the sequencing, the confidence, the empowered feeling as a yoga teacher. And this back to school offer includes an enrollment incentive, which is essentially a discount. So that's your opportunity. All of what you learned in this free podcast episode just gets amplified 100-fold working with me one-on-one. This is a one-on-one program. This is not a group program. You will have my undivided attention to support you over the 60 days. So if you're listening to this and you're in the month of August, don't wait until the end of the month. You need to get in touch with me during the month of August to unlock your enrollment in this special program, this special offer. So as soon as you're hearing this, as soon as you're listening to this, if you are interested in enrolling, send me a DM on Instagram. Let me know you listened to this episode and you want to know about the back to school special. You can just say back to school special and I'll know what you're talking about. And the final thing I'm going to say is, in order to work with me in my program, you need to have graduated from a 200-hour program. You need to have gone on the Yoga Alliance website and registered with them as a 200-hour level teacher. And you need to be teaching at least one paid class a week. If you don't meet those qualifications, you're not eligible to apply. Okay, so that is it. We're at the end of the 3-parter. I hope that you've enjoyed this. I hope you found this helpful. And I'll talk to you on the next episode. Thanks for listening to Conversations for Yoga Teachers. See you next time. Thanks for being here with me today. I hope you enjoyed it. And hey, one more thing. While I don't know you personally, I know what a yoga teacher looks like who's ready to work with me. She's ready to take action. She's looking for someone who has the answers she needs. She knows she's worth the investment. She can't wait to get all her prep time back. And she's excited to make a positive change. If that's you, DM me the words podcast offer to my Instagram, and I will give you a special incentive to work with me inside my signature program. My Instagram handle is Bare Bones Yoga. I can't wait to hear from you.